If we sell before winter, we can probably get $700,000 for the property. I froze in the hallway outside my own dining room when I heard my son say those words. For a moment, I honestly thought Michael was talking about somebody else's house. Maybe a client from work. Maybe one of the neighbors. But then my daughter Emily laughed softly and said, "Not if Mom decides to be stubborn about it." The tray in my hands suddenly felt heavier than it should have. 6 coffee cups rattled against the porcelain saucers as I stood there beside the family photos hanging on the wall, unable to move. They weren't talking about some stranger's house. They were talking about mine. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing my retirement party. After 42 years teaching 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary in Cedar Falls, Ohio, I thought I had earned one peaceful evening with my children under the same roof. I woke up at 5 that morning to bake Michael's favorite cinnamon coffee cake from scratch. I polished the silver serving tray Harold and I bought during our 10th anniversary trip to Vermont. I even pulled my good tablecloth out of the linen closet, the cream-colored one I only used on holidays because Harold always said it made the house look elegant. The house smelled like vanilla candles and fresh coffee when everyone arrived around 4 o'clock. My granddaughter Olivia hugged me first. She was 19 now, tall and quiet like her grandfather used to be, with soft brown hair tucked behind one ear and those thoughtful blue eyes that noticed everything. "Congratulations, Grandma," she whispered while helping me carry gifts into the kitchen. "I'm proud of you." Those words stayed with me because nobody else had really said them. Michael spent most of the evening talking on his phone near the back patio. Emily kept taking pictures of the decorations instead of sitting beside me. Rachel, my daughter-in-law, smiled constantly, but there was something rehearsed about it, something polished and empty underneath. At one point, she ran her hand across the dining room wall and casually said, "This place really is worth a fortune now." I remember laughing politely, because I thought she was simply making conversation. Now, standing outside the dining room with trembling hands, I realized she probably hadn't been joking at all. "Mom can't keep up with a house this size forever," Emily said quietly from inside the room. "She's 67. Eventually she'll need somewhere smaller." Michael lowered his voice, but not enough. "That's why we should start planning now instead of waiting until there's some kind of emergency." I stared down at the coffee slowly spilling over the edge of one cup onto the silver tray. My retirement party was still happening 10 feet away from me. I could hear soft jazz playing from the speaker in the living room. I could smell roast chicken and buttered rolls cooling in the kitchen. Through the dining room doorway, I could even see the gold balloons Olivia had taped beside the fireplace earlier that afternoon. "Happy retirement, Mom." The words suddenly felt cruel somehow. Harold had been gone for almost 8 years, but in that moment I missed him so badly my chest physically ached. He built this house with his own hands before Michael was born. Every Saturday for nearly 2 years, he worked on it piece by piece while I graded spelling tests at the kitchen table of our tiny apartment downtown. I still remembered the way he looked carrying Emily through the front door for the first time after we moved in. "This house will take care of us," he had whispered back then. I used to believe that. "We'd have to redo the kitchen before listing it," Rachel added casually. "But honestly, young buyers love this neighborhood." Young buyers. Listing it. My fingers tightened around the tray until my knuckles turned white. Not one of them had asked what I wanted. Not one of them had even waited until my retirement party ended before deciding what should happen to my home after I was no longer useful in it. "Maybe assisted living wouldn't even be bad for her," Emily said carefully. "Some of those places are really nice now." Something inside me went completely still after that. Not shattered. Not broken. Just still. The kind of silence that settles over a lake before snow begins to fall. I took one slow breath, lifted the tray properly in my hands, and walked into the dining room with the calmest smile I could manage. "Fresh coffee," I said softly. 3 faces turned toward me at once. Michael looked startled for half a second before recovering. Emily reached for her cup too quickly. Rachel smiled that same polished smile again. Nobody spoke. Nobody asked how long I had been standing there. I set the tray down carefully beside the cheesecake and looked around the room I had spent 35 years turning into a home. The oak dining table Harold refinished by hand. The faded scratch near the hallway from Michael's skateboard accident in 1994. The family photos lining the fireplace mantel. Every inch of that house carried pieces of my life inside it. And suddenly, for the very first time, I understood something cold and terrible. My children were no longer looking at this house as memories. They were looking at it as money. After everyone left that night, the house became painfully quiet. I stood alone in the kitchen holding a damp dish towel while the grandfather clock near the staircase ticked loud enough to make the silence feel heavier. Half-eaten slices of cheesecake sat forgotten on paper plates beside melting ice cubes and lipstick-stained coffee cups. Someone had left a folded napkin on the floor near the dining room table. One of the gold retirement balloons had already drifted halfway down the wall, its tape slowly giving up. I should have felt proud that evening. 42 years in the same elementary school. Hundreds of children passing through my classroom. Generations of families who still waved when they saw me at the grocery store. Earlier that week, the principal had hugged me in front of the entire faculty lounge and called me the heart of Lincoln Elementary. But standing there in my own kitchen, all I could think about was the way Michael casually discussed selling my home before the coffee had even cooled on the table. I picked up plates one by one and rinsed them beneath warm water while their voices replayed inside my head. We should start planning now. Assisted living would not even be bad for her. Young buyers love this neighborhood. The strange thing was not that they said those things. It was how comfortable they sounded saying them. As if the conversation had started long before tonight. As if I was simply arriving late to plans already being made around me. I dried my hands slowly and looked around the kitchen Harold built for me 30 years ago. The white cabinets needed repainting near the stove. The tile floor had tiny cracks near the pantry from decades of heavy footsteps. The overhead light flickered every so often because Harold never got around to replacing the wiring before he passed away. None of it was perfect. But every inch of that kitchen belonged to our life together. I remembered standing right there beside the sink one snowy December morning while Michael and Emily, both still children then, sat at the table making Christmas ornaments from construction paper. Harold burned pancakes because he was too busy helping Emily sprinkle glitter onto cardboard stars. We laughed so hard that morning. I could still hear it sometimes if the house became quiet enough. I loaded the last plate into the dishwasher and glanced through the window above the sink. The backyard looked silver beneath the porch light. Harold planted that maple tree near the fence the summer Michael turned 10. It was taller than the roof now. Everything around me carried history. Meanwhile, my children spoke about the house like strangers flipping through real estate listings online. Around midnight, I carried a trash bag toward the front hallway and noticed Michael's jacket hanging over the coat rack. He must have forgotten it during the party. I reached into the pocket automatically, searching for his car keys so I could call him before bed. Instead, my fingers brushed against folded paper. I almost ignored it. I wish I had. The paper was covered with printed numbers and handwritten notes. Estimated listing price. Renovation costs. Property taxes. There was even a realtor's business card clipped to the front with my address written neatly across the top in blue ink. My stomach tightened so suddenly I had to sit down on the staircase. I stared at the papers while the hallway lamp cast soft yellow light across the pages. This was not a casual conversation between siblings wondering about the future someday. This was preparation, planning, research. Someone had already calculated what my life was worth once converted into square footage and market value. I do not know how long I sat there before I heard footsteps behind me. Grandma? Olivia's voice startled me. She had apparently come back inside after helping her boyfriend load gifts into the car. Her eyes moved from my face to the papers in my lap, and something changed in her expression immediately. Not confusion. Recognition. You heard them, did you not? She asked quietly. I looked down at the papers again instead of answering. Olivia sat beside me on the stairs without saying anything for a few seconds. She smelled faintly like vanilla perfume and cold night air. I tried telling Mom to stop bringing it up, she whispered eventually. But they have all been talking about the house for months. My chest felt hollow. Months? Olivia nodded slowly. Aunt Emily thinks you should move closer to her in Columbus. Dad keeps saying this neighborhood is too expensive to hold on to. Rachel found a retirement community online last winter and showed it to everybody after Thanksgiving dinner. Last winter, while I was wrapping gifts for them, baking pies, mailing birthday cards. I closed my eyes briefly. The humiliation hurt more than the betrayal itself. They had discussed rearranging my life the same way people discuss replacing old furniture. Quietly, logically, efficiently. Olivia leaned her head gently against my shoulder. I told them you love this house, she said softly. I told them Grandpa built it for you. I swallowed hard and looked around the hallway one more time. The framed family photos lining the wall suddenly felt different somehow, like evidence from another lifetime. In every picture, I saw a woman who believed she was surrounded by people who valued her. But now I understood something I had not wanted to admit before. Somewhere along the way, my children had stopped seeing me as their mother. They had started seeing me as the last obstacle standing between them and everything I owned. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise without meaning to. For years, my body had been trained to rise early for school mornings, coffee brewing before 6, lesson plans spread across the kitchen table while the neighborhood still slept. But this time there were no lesson plans waiting for me. No classroom. No students asking how to spell difficult words or raising sticky hands in the air after recess. Just silence. I lay in bed staring at the pale morning light creeping across the ceiling while the conversation from the party replayed itself again and again inside my head. Around 7 o'clock, I finally got up and walked downstairs wearing Harold's old gray cardigan over my nightgown. The house creaked softly beneath my feet the same way it always had during cold mornings. Normally, those familiar sounds comforted me. That morning, they only reminded me how alone I suddenly felt inside my own home. I poured coffee into my favorite ceramic mug, the blue one Olivia painted for me when she was 10 years old, and sat at the kitchen table facing the backyard. Frost covered the grass in thin silver patches. Harold would have complained about the furnace bill if he had seen how early winter was arriving that year. I almost smiled thinking about it. Then my eyes drifted toward the stack of papers I had placed beside the fruit bowl after finding them in Michael's jacket pocket. Property estimates. Realtor information. Market trends. I had barely slept after reading them. At first, I tried convincing myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe Michael was only curious about home values. Maybe Emily mentioned assisted living out of concern rather than greed. But deep down, another part of me already knew better. The signs had been there for years. I just had not wanted to see them. Suddenly memories started resurfacing one after another, small moments I dismissed at the time because mothers are experts at forgiving things before they fully understand them. Last Thanksgiving, Rachel spent almost 20 minutes asking how much Harold originally paid for the house back in the 1980s. At the time I thought she was simply making conversation while helping me peel potatoes in the kitchen. You got so lucky buying property before prices exploded, she said casually while checking something on her phone. I remember laughing and telling her Harold worked overtime shifts at the factory for nearly 7 years to afford the down payment. She barely looked up when I said it. 2 months later, Emily visited on a Sunday afternoon carrying brochures for luxury retirement communities near Columbus. I just thought you might want to look someday, she said carefully while placing them beside my coffee cup. I remember feeling irritated because I had just spent 3 hours climbing a ladder to clean my gutters without help. I am not exactly ready for bingo nights and water aerobics, I joked back then. Emily laughed too quickly. Of course not, Mom. I am just thinking ahead. Thinking ahead. That phrase sounded different now. Even Michael had changed after Harold passed away. Before, he used to visit just to sit with me on the porch and drink coffee while talking about baseball or work or old family vacations. But over the last few years, every conversation somehow drifted toward practical matters. Taxes. Insurance. Maintenance costs. This place must be exhausting to keep up with alone, he said one evening while examining the living room ceiling for water stains after a thunderstorm. Another time he suggested selling the house and splitting the money wisely before the market changed. I remember feeling hurt when he said that because Harold had barely been gone 2 years. The thought of strangers walking through our home during an open house made me physically sick. But Michael simply shrugged and said, "I am only trying to help you think long term." I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and stared out the window while all those memories clicked together with painful clarity. It was like watching a photograph slowly sharpen into focus after years of blur. They had not suddenly become interested in my future overnight. They had been preparing for this moment quietly, patiently, waiting for me to grow older so their suggestions would sound reasonable instead of cruel. Around 8:30, my phone buzzed against the kitchen table. Michael. For a second, I considered ignoring it. Instead, I answered calmly. "Morning, Mom," he said. His voice sounded cheerful in the careful way people sound when they suspect they may already be guilty of something. "Did I leave my jacket there last night?" I glanced toward the folded papers beside the fruit bowl. "You did. I can stop by after work and grab it," he replied quickly. "No rush," I said softly. There was a short silence before he spoke again. "You doing okay this morning?" Such a simple question. But something about it felt rehearsed. Polite. Like customer service. I looked around the kitchen Harold built with his own hands. The curtains I sewed 20 years ago still hanging above the sink. The tiny pencil marks near the pantry door measuring Michael and Emily's height as children. The family calendar still open to October even though November had already begun. "I am fine," I answered finally. And in that moment, I realized something that unsettled me even more than the betrayal itself. My children no longer spoke to me like family members protecting someone they loved. They spoke to me the way investors speak about property they are waiting to acquire. That afternoon, after Michael picked up his jacket, I found myself standing alone in the garage staring at shelves Harold built almost 30 years ago. The smell of old cedar wood and motor oil still lingered faintly in the air. His toolbox remained exactly where he left it before the heart attack took him 8 years earlier. I had never moved it. Every screwdriver, every measuring tape, every loose nail resting inside rusted coffee cans still sat untouched beneath the workbench. Michael barely stayed 5 minutes when he came by. He walked in smiling too brightly, kissed my cheek, grabbed his jacket, and kept glancing toward the folded papers sitting on the kitchen counter. Neither of us mentioned them. But I noticed how quickly he slipped the documents back into his pocket once he realized I had seen them. "You should think about taking it easy now that you are retired," he said while standing near the front door. "No more climbing ladders or carrying heavy boxes around." His tone sounded warm on the surface, but underneath it I heard something else now. Assessment. Calculation. Like he was mentally measuring how much longer I could manage on my own. I smiled politely and told him I would be careful. Then I watched his car disappear down the street while cold November wind rattled the bare tree branches above the driveway. After he left, I wandered into the garage without really meaning to. That was always where Harold went whenever life overwhelmed him. If bills were tight, he worked in the garage. If Michael got suspended from school for fighting, Harold disappeared into the garage afterward and sanded old furniture until midnight. If Emily cried over some high school boyfriend breaking her heart, Harold fixed bicycles in the garage until she finally wandered out there beside him and started talking. The garage was where he thought clearly. I ran my fingers slowly across the wooden workbench and suddenly remembered the summer Harold built our kitchen cabinets by hand because custom cabinets were too expensive. Every evening after working 10-hour shifts at the factory, he came home exhausted, changed into old jeans, and spent hours in the garage teaching himself carpentry from library books. I used to stand in the doorway holding 2 glasses of lemonade while he measured pieces of oak beneath the yellow overhead light. "Someday this house will be worth all the sacrifice," I told him once. Harold laughed softly and wiped sawdust from his hands. "That is not why I am building it," he said. "I am building it so you always have somewhere nobody can take away from you." At the time, I thought he meant financial security. But standing there decades later, I realized Harold understood something about people that I had spent most of my life trying not to see. Homes are never just buildings. They become leverage. Power. Inheritance. Especially after someone grows old enough for others to start discussing what happens next. My eyes drifted toward an old metal filing cabinet beside the workbench. I had not opened it in years. Inside were stacks of receipts, instruction manuals, faded photographs, and folders labeled in Harold's careful handwriting. Furnace. Repairs. Mortgage papers. Property taxes. Beneath them all sat a thick manila envelope with my name written across the front. Helen. Just Helen. Something about seeing his handwriting after all these years made my throat tighten unexpectedly. I carried the envelope inside and sat at the kitchen table while afternoon light faded slowly through the curtains. Inside were insurance papers, copies of our original mortgage documents, and several handwritten notes folded neatly between them. One page caught my attention immediately because Harold had underlined part of it in blue ink. If anything happens to me, do not let anyone pressure you into leaving this house before you are ready. Not the children. Not anybody. You earned this home with your life just as much as I did. I stared at those words for a very long time. Harold wrote them shortly after his first hospital stay, back when doctors still believed medication might stabilize his heart condition. I remembered him sitting at this exact kitchen table late one evening sorting paperwork while pretending not to be frightened about his health. Meanwhile, I stood at the stove making soup and pretending not to notice his hands trembling slightly. He knew before I did. He knew there might come a day when people would look at me differently once he was gone. Suddenly another memory surfaced so clearly it almost hurt. About 2 years before Harold died, Michael joked during Christmas dinner that the house would probably make somebody rich one day because property values in Cedar Falls kept rising. Everyone laughed. Even me. But Harold did not. He simply looked at Michael quietly for a second before changing the subject. At the time I thought he was tired. Now I wondered if he had already noticed the shift happening long before I did. The sun disappeared completely outside while I sat there rereading Harold's note over and over again. Somewhere upstairs, the furnace clicked on with a low hum. Pipes creaked softly inside the walls. The house sounded alive around me, familiar and steady despite everything. And for the first time since the retirement party, I felt something stronger than hurt beginning to settle inside me. Clarity. My children believed age had made me weaker. Easier to guide. Easier to convince. But they had forgotten something important about women who spend decades holding families together. We notice far more than people think we do. Sometimes we simply choose silence until the right moment arrives. 3 days later, I drove to the grocery store just after 8 in the morning because Wednesdays were usually quiet there. Most people my age avoided shopping that early in November because the cold settled deep into your bones before the sun fully rose, but I needed time outside the house to think. The parking lot was still wet from overnight rain when I pulled my old Honda into a space near the entrance. Inside, the store smelled faintly of cinnamon candles and fresh bread from the bakery section. Christmas decorations had already appeared near the registers even though Thanksgiving was still weeks away. I moved slowly through the aisles with my cart, picking up things out of habit more than necessity. Coffee filters. Soup. Eggs. A small bouquet of white carnations because Harold used to buy flowers every Friday no matter how tight money became. I was standing near the produce section comparing apples when I heard my name. Helen Brooks. I turned and saw Margaret Ellis hurrying toward me with a surprised smile. Margaret worked at Cedar Falls Realty for nearly 20 years before retiring last spring. She and Harold used to serve together on the church fundraising committee long ago. We were never close friends exactly, but we knew each other well enough for long conversations whenever we crossed paths in town. I almost did not recognize you without your teacher clothes, she joked gently while adjusting the scarf around her neck. I smiled politely. Retirement apparently makes people invisible overnight. Margaret laughed softly at that, but her expression shifted after a moment. I heard about your party, she said. Olivia posted pictures online. The house looked beautiful. My grip tightened slightly on the shopping cart handle. Thank you. There was a brief silence before Margaret glanced around carefully like someone deciding whether or not to say something uncomfortable. Helen, she said quietly, lowering her voice, I hope you do not mind me asking this, but are you planning to put your house on the market soon? I felt the cold from outside return suddenly beneath my skin. No, I answered slowly. Why would you ask that? Margaret hesitated long enough for me to know the answer before she even spoke. Your daughter-in-law called our office about 2 months ago asking for a preliminary estimate on the property. For a second, the grocery store noise around me faded completely. Shopping carts squeaked across tile floors somewhere nearby. A child cried near the cereal aisle. The overhead speakers played soft Christmas music too early in the season. But all of it sounded distant now. "Rachel?" I asked carefully. Margaret nodded once. She said she was helping family prepare for future planning. My chest felt strangely hollow. Not sharp pain anymore. Something colder. More settled. "Did Michael know?" I asked. Margaret gave me a look that told me everything. She mentioned both your children during the conversation. I stared down at the apples stacked neatly in front of me while years of denial finally collapsed completely inside my mind. This was not concern. It was not family trying to protect me from aging alone. They had already moved beyond discussion and into preparation. Meetings. Estimates. Plans. Quiet little conversations held behind my back while I continued hosting holidays and baking birthday cakes for them like nothing had changed. Margaret touched my arm gently. "Helen, I hope I did not overstep telling you this." I forced myself to smile. "No," I said softly. "Actually, I think you did me a favor." We talked another few minutes about harmless things after that. Weather. Retirement. Church bake sales. But I barely heard any of it. My mind kept replaying the image of Rachel sitting in a real estate office discussing my home while smiling that polished smile she always wore during family dinners. On the drive home, the town looked different somehow. The old movie theater downtown. The coffee shop Harold loved near Main Street. The park where Michael learned to ride a bicycle. Everything felt connected to memories my children no longer valued the same way I did. By the time I pulled into my driveway, a strange calmness had settled over me. Not sadness exactly. Clarity. The kind that arrives after the last illusion finally breaks. Inside the house, I placed groceries on the kitchen counter and noticed a voicemail blinking on the home phone machine. Emily's voice filled the kitchen a second later. "Hey Mom, just checking in. Rachel found this really nice active adult community online near Columbus. They have fitness classes and social events and everything. No pressure, obviously. Just thought you might want to look at the website sometime." I stood there listening to the message twice. Her tone sounded cheerful. Casual. Like she was recommending a restaurant instead of suggesting I leave the home Harold built for me with his own hands. When the message ended, I pressed delete slowly and stared out the kitchen window toward the backyard maple tree swaying beneath gray afternoon clouds. Then I walked upstairs to the bedroom closet and pulled down the small lockbox Harold insisted we keep hidden years ago. Inside were birth certificates, savings bonds, insurance documents, and the name of the attorney who handled our estate planning after Harold became sick. I sat on the edge of the bed holding the attorney's business card between my fingers while silence filled the room around me. Somewhere downstairs, the old grandfather clock chimed 3 times. My children believed they were planning my future carefully without my knowledge. What they did not understand yet was that I had finally started planning too. The attorney's office sat on the second floor above an old insurance agency downtown, in a brick building I had walked past hundreds of times without ever really noticing. Rain tapped softly against the windows the morning I drove there. The sky hung low and gray over Cedar Falls, and wet leaves clung to the sidewalks beneath bare trees lining Main Street. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat inside my car watching people hurry through the cold carrying coffee cups and umbrellas. For a moment, I almost turned around and drove home. Some stubborn part of me still wanted to believe all of this was simply a misunderstanding that had grown larger inside my head than it truly was. But then I remembered Rachel requesting property estimates behind my back. I remembered Michael's papers folded inside his jacket pocket. I remembered Emily cheerfully recommending retirement communities as if my life could be packed neatly into brochures and floor plans. So I stepped out into the cold and walked upstairs. Daniel Mercer looked older than I remembered. Harold and I first met him nearly 20 years earlier when we finalized our wills after Michael got married. Back then his hair had still been mostly brown. Now it was silver around the temples, and reading glasses rested low on his nose as he stood to shake my hand warmly. "Helen Brooks," he said gently. "I was sorry to hear about your retirement. The school system will not be the same without you." I smiled faintly and sat down across from him while rain streaked softly against the office windows behind his desk. The room smelled like old books and coffee. For a few seconds, I could not bring myself to explain why I was really there. I simply stared at my hands folded tightly in my lap. Daniel waited patiently. Finally, I looked up and asked the question that had been sitting heavily inside my chest for days. What options does someone have if they do not want their children deciding their future for them? Daniel's expression changed carefully. Not surprised exactly, just attentive. "That depends on the situation," he replied slowly. "Are you feeling pressured by your family?" I hesitated before answering. "I think my children have already started planning what happens to my house after I am gone." Saying the words aloud made something painful settle more firmly into reality. Daniel listened quietly while I explained everything. The party conversation, the realtor inquiries, the brochures, Michael's paperwork. I noticed myself speaking calmly, almost clinically, even though my stomach twisted tighter with every sentence. When I finished, Daniel leaned back in his chair and sighed softly. "Unfortunately," he said, "this happens more often than people realize." That sentence stayed with me. More often than people realize. Suddenly I imagined how many older people sat inside offices like this trying to understand when concern quietly transformed into entitlement. Daniel opened a folder on his desk and explained different legal protections slowly and carefully. Living trusts, property transfers, medical directives, financial control. He never once made me feel foolish for being there. In fact, the calmer he spoke, the clearer my own thinking became. "Helen," he said after a while, "the important thing is this. You are mentally competent, financially stable, and fully capable of making your own decisions. Do not let anyone make you feel otherwise simply because you are getting older." I swallowed hard because nobody in my family had said anything remotely like that in a very long time. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing documents Harold and I prepared years earlier. Everything was straightforward. The house belonged entirely to me now. Every decision still rested in my hands. Daniel suggested updating certain protections immediately, especially regarding the property. If your children are already discussing sales and future arrangements without your knowledge, he said carefully, it is wise to establish boundaries legally before assumptions become expectations. By the time I left the office, the rain had stopped. Thin sunlight pushed weakly through the clouds as I walked back toward my car carrying a slim folder tucked beneath my arm. Something inside me felt steadier than it had in weeks. Not angry. Not emotional. Focused. That evening, Michael called again around dinner time. "Hey Mom," he said casually. "Rachel and I were thinking maybe we could come by Saturday and help you organize some things around the house. The garage probably needs cleaning before winter." I stood at the kitchen sink peeling potatoes while the phone rested against my shoulder. His voice sounded generous, helpful, thoughtful, and for the first time, I heard the performance underneath it clearly. "That is sweet of you," I answered softly. "But I think I will manage just fine." There was a brief pause. "You sure?" "Very sure." Silence settled. Between us for half a second too long. Then Michael laughed lightly. "Okay, Mom. Just trying to help." After we hung up, I finished making dinner and carried my plate into the dining room alone. The house no longer felt fragile around me. If anything, it felt watchful, protective. Harold's note remained folded carefully inside my sweater pocket all day. "Do not let anyone pressure you into leaving this house before you are ready." As I sat there beneath the warm glow of the dining room chandelier, listening to the familiar ticking of the grandfather clock nearby, I realized my children had made one very serious mistake. They assumed age automatically meant weakness. But age also teaches patience. And patience can become a very dangerous thing when someone has finally stopped doubting what they already know. By the following week, the change in my children became almost theatrical. Michael suddenly called every morning asking whether I needed groceries or help with yard work. Emily sent me links to articles about healthy aging and retirement hobbies 3 times a day. Rachel even dropped off homemade chicken soup one afternoon despite the fact that she had never cooked for me voluntarily in 15 years. If I had not known about the realtor inquiries and property estimates, their behavior might have looked loving from the outside. But once a person sees the truth clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee it. Every kindness started feeling rehearsed. Every smile carried calculation underneath it. Saturday afternoon, Michael and Rachel arrived together carrying coffee and pastries from the bakery downtown. The air outside smelled like wet leaves and chimney smoke drifting through the neighborhood. I watched them walk up the driveway through the front window while pretending to straighten magazines on the living room table. Rachel wore an expensive cream-colored coat and carried herself with the careful confidence of someone entering a space she already imagined belonging to her someday. "Mom," Michael said warmly after stepping inside. "We thought maybe we could spend the afternoon helping around the house." Rachel smiled brightly. "You should not be handling everything alone now that winter is coming." I invited them in calmly and poured coffee while soft jazz played from the kitchen radio. The entire time, I could feel them studying the house differently than before. Michael glanced toward the ceiling corners near the dining room as if mentally estimating repair costs. Rachel slowly walked through the kitchen, touching cabinet handles and countertops while pretending to admire them. "This kitchen has so much charm," she said casually. Although younger buyers usually prefer open concepts these days. Younger buyers. There it was again. They could not help themselves. I stirred cream into my coffee slowly and smiled faintly. "Harold built most of these cabinets himself," I replied. Rachel nodded politely, but her eyes had already drifted toward the backyard through the kitchen window. "The lot alone must be worth a fortune now," she said. Michael shot her a quick look over his coffee cup, probably realizing she had spoken too freely again. "Rachel just means the neighborhood has gotten expensive lately," he corrected quickly. I pretended not to notice either of them becoming uncomfortable. Instead, I asked whether Olivia was still enjoying college classes. That relaxed the conversation briefly. But then Michael casually mentioned that a coworker recently sold his mother's home after moving her into a retirement community near Dayton. "Honestly," he said while leaning back in his chair, "she ended up happier there. More social opportunities. Less stress." I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "Interesting." Rachel folded her hands carefully on the table. "There are actually some beautiful places now for active seniors. Fitness centers, restaurants, transportation services." Her voice sounded almost too smooth, like someone reading from a brochure they already memorized. I looked directly at her for the first time that afternoon. "You seem to know quite a bit about them." Something flickered across her face for half a second before she smiled again. "I just think people deserve support as they get older." Older. The words settled between us quietly. Not elderly. Not incapable. Just older. But I understood the implication perfectly. To them, aging automatically meant transition. Downsizing. Relocation. Handing control to younger hands. Michael stood up after lunch and offered to organize the garage while Rachel insisted on helping me fold laundry upstairs. I agreed to both. Not because I needed help, but because I wanted to watch them more carefully now that my eyes were fully open. Upstairs, Rachel followed me into the bedroom carrying folded towels against her chest. Her eyes drifted slowly around the room while I sorted laundry beside the bed. Harold's photograph still sat on the nightstand exactly where it always had. "You know," Rachel said gently after a while, "houses this large can become overwhelming faster than people expect." I kept folding towels calmly. "I manage just fine." "Of course," she replied quickly. "I just worry sometimes. Stairs can become difficult unexpectedly. Maintenance too." There was something almost practiced in the softness of her tone. Like she had rehearsed these conversations privately long before speaking them aloud to me. I glanced toward Harold's photo briefly before answering. This house survived 2 children, 3 dogs, a broken furnace, and 40 Ohio winters. I think it can survive me for a little while longer. Rachel laughed politely, but I noticed her smile tighten at the edges. Downstairs, I later found Michael standing alone in the garage staring at Harold's old workbench. His expression looked thoughtful in a way that unsettled me. Not emotional. Evaluative. Like someone mentally redesigning a space they expected to inherit eventually. Dad kept this place organized, he said quietly when he noticed me nearby. He loved this garage, I answered. Michael nodded slowly before adding, eventually this property could really help the whole family financially. There it was. Finally spoken aloud. Not directly. Not cruelly. But clearly enough. I looked at my son standing beneath the same overhead light Harold installed 20 years earlier and suddenly realized something deeply painful. Michael genuinely believed he sounded practical rather than selfish. In his mind, the house had already become a future resource, waiting to be unlocked. Meanwhile, I was simply the aging person still standing in the way of those plans. That night after they left, I walked room to room through the quiet house while darkness settled outside the windows. The living room, the hallway, the kitchen. Every space carried traces of lives built carefully over decades. My children saw square footage and market value now. But I still saw scraped knees, Christmas mornings, science fair projects, late-night talks, birthday candles, and Harold falling asleep in his recliner after long factory shifts. And as I stood there listening to the familiar creaks of the old hardwood floors beneath my feet, I understood with complete certainty that I was no longer protecting a house. I was protecting the final piece of my own dignity. The following Friday, I invited everyone to dinner. Michael sounded almost relieved when I called him. Emily immediately asked if there was something important I wanted to discuss. Rachel offered to bring dessert before I even finished speaking. The eagerness in their voices told me exactly what they thought was coming. By then, the paperwork with Daniel Mercer was already complete. Every signature had been notarized 2 days earlier. The house, along with most of my remaining assets, had been transferred into a protected trust exactly the way Harold and I once discussed long ago, but never finalized before his death. I slept peacefully for the first time in weeks after signing those documents. Not because I wanted revenge. Because uncertainty had finally disappeared. Outside, the first real snow of the season arrived the morning of the dinner. Thin white flakes drifted slowly across Cedar Falls all afternoon, coating rooftops and tree branches in soft layers of ice. By 6 o'clock, the neighborhood looked quiet and silver beneath the streetlights. I spent the day cooking the same meal Harold loved during winter evenings. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes. Fresh dinner rolls. Apple pie cooling beside the kitchen window. Familiar things. Steady things. The dining room looked warm beneath the chandelier light when everyone arrived. Michael carried a bottle of wine. Rachel brought in expensive cheesecake from the bakery downtown. Emily hugged me tightly at the door in a way that felt overly careful somehow, like someone handling fragile glass. Olivia arrived last, cheeks pink from the cold, carrying a small bouquet of white carnations without saying much. During dinner, everyone behaved almost unnaturally pleasant. Michael asked about retirement hobbies. Emily talked about taking weekend trips together someday. Rachel repeatedly offered to help organize closets or clean out the basement whenever I felt ready. Ready. That word again. I listened quietly while carving slices of pot roast onto their plates. The snow outside continued falling steadily against the dark windows behind them. Halfway through dinner, Michael finally leaned back in his chair and cleared his throat softly. "Mom," he began carefully, "Rachel and I have been thinking a lot about your future lately." Of course they had. Emily nodded immediately. "We just want to make sure you are supported as life changes." Supported. Life changes. Every sentence sounded polished now. Rehearsed. Rachel folded her hands together beside her wine glass and smiled gently. "This house is beautiful, Helen. But eventually it might become overwhelming maintaining it alone." I placed my fork down carefully beside my plate. Nobody spoke after that. The grandfather clock near the hallway ticked softly in the silence. Snow brushed against the windows outside. Somewhere in the kitchen, the dishwasher hummed quietly beneath the counter. Michael glanced at Emily briefly before continuing. "We are not saying you need to decide anything immediately, but maybe it would help to start thinking practically." Practically. Such an interesting word. People often use it when they want emotional decisions to sound reasonable. I looked around the table slowly before speaking. Michael avoiding direct eye contact. Emily nervously twisting her napkin between her fingers. Rachel sitting perfectly still with that calm, polished expression she always wore when pretending concern. Olivia watching all of them silently from the far end of the table. "You're right," I said softly. 3 faces lifted immediately. "I have been thinking practically lately." Michael nodded with visible relief. "Good. That is good, Mom." I reached beside my chair and picked up a slim manila folder resting there against the table leg. The room grew noticeably quieter as I placed it gently in front of me. Rachel's smile faded first. "Earlier this week," I continued calmly, "I finalized some important legal decisions regarding the house and my estate planning." Nobody moved. Michael stared at the folder. Emily blinked quickly. Rachel's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her wine glass. "I transferred the property into a protected trust," I said. "The house will never be sold privately after my death." Silence. Complete silence. Even the dishwasher seemed louder suddenly. Michael frowned first. "What does that mean?" His voice sounded cautious now rather than warm. I folded my hands neatly in front of me. "It means the property will eventually become part of a scholarship foundation in Harold's name for local students pursuing teaching and trade careers." Emily stared at me in open confusion. "A scholarship?" Rachel spoke next, too quickly. "Wait. The house is not staying in the family." There it was. Finally. Not concern for me. Not sadness. Not disappointment. Just shock that the asset they had quietly planned around no longer belonged to them. I looked directly at her. This house already served its purpose for the family. Harold and I spent 40 years building lives inside it. We are done owing it to anyone. Michael sat back heavily in his chair. "Mom, nobody is asking you to owe us anything." The lie hung there awkwardly between us. I remained calm. "You discussed selling this house before my retirement party was even over." His face drained of color instantly. Emily looked at him sharply. Rachel's expression hardened for half a second before smoothing itself again. "You misunderstood," Michael said quietly. "Did I?" I asked. Nobody answered. The snow continued falling softly outside while the warmth slowly disappeared from the room. Olivia looked down at her plate silently, but I noticed the faintest trace of relief in her expression. Across the table, my children suddenly looked less like loving family members and more like people realizing a deal they expected to close had quietly vanished before they could sign their names to it. Nobody stayed long after dinner ended that night. Michael muttered something about the roads getting worse because of the snowstorm. Emily avoided looking directly at me while putting on her coat near the front door. Rachel barely spoke at all. The warmth they carried into the house earlier had vanished completely now, replaced by tight smiles and uncomfortable silence. Only Olivia hugged me goodbye properly. She wrapped her arms around me near the doorway and whispered softly, "Grandpa would be proud of you." I nearly lost my composure hearing that, but I simply squeezed her hand and watched everyone disappear into the snowy darkness outside. After the cars pulled away, the house became still again. Snow continued falling steadily beneath the porch light, covering tire tracks in soft white layers until the street looked untouched once more. I stood alone in the living room beside the Christmas decorations I had not finished unpacking yet and listened to the grandfather clock ticking steadily near the hallway. For the first time in months, the silence did not feel lonely. It felt honest. The next few weeks revealed more than the dinner itself ever could. Michael stopped calling every morning. Emily suddenly became busy most weekends. Rachel no longer dropped off soup or sent links to retirement communities. The performance ended the moment the inheritance disappeared. That hurt more deeply than I expected, even though I already knew the truth. There is something uniquely painful about watching your own children withdraw affection the instant they realize they are no longer financially benefiting from your future. Still, I refused to let bitterness settle permanently inside me. I had spent too many years building a life around love to become consumed by disappointment now. Instead, I focused on reclaiming pieces of myself I had quietly neglected for years. I repainted the upstairs guest bedroom pale blue one snowy afternoon while old Frank Sinatra records played downstairs. I joined a Saturday morning reading group at the local library. I started taking long walks through Cedar Falls whenever weather allowed, bundled in Harold's old wool coat while frost sparkled across empty baseball fields and quiet sidewalks. Slowly, the house began feeling like mine again instead of a battlefield disguised as a family home. Around mid-December, Olivia started visiting every Thursday evening after her college classes. Sometimes we baked cookies together. Sometimes we simply sat in the kitchen drinking tea while snow drifted outside the windows. She never once mentioned the trust or the argument at dinner unless I brought it up first. That mattered more to me than she probably realized. One Thursday night, while we rolled out sugar cookie dough on the kitchen counter, Olivia suddenly looked up and asked quietly, "Do you regret telling them?" I thought about that carefully before answering. The mixer hummed softly nearby while cinnamon filled the kitchen air. "No," I said finally. "I regret that they gave me a reason to." Olivia nodded slowly like someone much older than 19. "Dad has been angry," she admitted after a moment. "He keeps saying you blindsided everyone." I almost laughed at that. "Interesting choice of words," I replied softly. Especially considering I was apparently the only person not included in conversations about my own future. Olivia lowered her eyes toward the cookie dough without defending him. Silence settled gently between us after that. Outside, wind rattled bare branches against the side of the house. Inside, warm light reflected softly across the same kitchen where I once packed school lunches and frosted birthday cakes for children who now treated me like an obstacle rather than a mother. A few days before Christmas, Michael finally called again. His voice sounded careful from the very beginning. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think maybe things got out of hand." I stood beside the living room window adjusting tree lights while listening. "Maybe they did," I answered. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "You made it sound like we only cared about the house." The sadness in his voice almost reached me for a moment. Almost. But then I remembered Rachel meeting with realtors behind my back. I remembered brochures, property estimates, conversations held in hallways during my retirement party. "No," I replied calmly. "You made it sound that way yourselves." Silence. Then a tired sigh on the other end of the phone. I was trying to think practically. Practicality without compassion becomes entitlement faster than people realize, I said quietly. Michael did not answer immediately. For the first time in weeks, he sounded less defensive and more uncertain. "I never wanted you to feel unwanted," he admitted finally. My eyes drifted across the living room toward Harold's photograph sitting beside the fireplace. "But I did," I said softly. "For a very long time." Neither of us spoke after that. Outside the window, snowflakes drifted slowly beneath the streetlights while Christmas music played faintly from a neighbor's house down the block. Eventually, Michael told me he loved me before hanging up. I believed he meant it. That was the complicated part. My children did love me in their own flawed way. But somewhere along the road between adulthood, mortgages, careers, and financial pressure, they stopped seeing me as a person with dignity separate from what I owned. And perhaps that was the real heartbreak underneath everything. Not greed itself, but how easily people can confuse love with expectation once inheritance enters the room. Later that night, after turning off the Christmas tree lights downstairs, I walked slowly through the quiet house before bed. The hallway photographs, the worn staircase, the kitchen cabinets Harold built by hand. Everything remained exactly where it had always been. But I had changed. I no longer feared growing older inside these walls. Because now I understood something clearly that took me 67 years to learn. Family is not measured by who waits for what you leave behind. It is measured by who still stays when there is nothing left to gain.